All right, let's dive in. Today, we're looking at an economic system that promises to unite a nation and make it strong. But, well, it often ends in a spiral of debt and war. We're going to peel back the layers on something called a command economy, one that has a very, very deceptive capitalist coat of paint. So, what on earth do we even mean by that? Well, picture this. It's a system where on the surface, businesses look private. Profits seem to be flowing like normal. But just behind the curtain, the state is pulling every single string. So, how does that even work? And why would anyone go for it in the first place? That's the big mystery we're unpacking today. The whole idea kicks off with this really powerful, almost seductive philosophy. The idea of treating the entire nation as if it were a single, living organism. To really get why this was so appealing, you have to rewind to the early 20th century. The world felt like it was being torn apart by class conflict, and there was this widespread feeling that individualism was just making nations weak and fractured. This new model came along and promised a cure for all that messy division. And that cure had a name: national syndicalism. The core metaphor here is really key. The economy doesn't exist to make you, the consumer, happy, or even to serve the worker. Nope. Its one and only purpose is to serve the nation itself, which is imagined as this giant, unified body. Let's break that metaphor down a bit. In this national body, the state is the brain. It's the central command, the nervous system, making every single decision for the good of the whole. And its commands? They're non-negotiable. So if the state is the brain, then every other part of the economy, all of industry, agriculture, labor, those are the organs. Each one has a very specific job to do. And it's not about competing or innovating for its own sake. It's about functioning in perfect harmony with all the other organs, exactly as the brain commands. And that brings us to the last and maybe the most crucial piece of this metaphor. If the nation is a healthy body, then things like individualism, personal ambition, and definitely independent unions, well, they're seen as a disease. They're an infection that threatens the health of the entire organism, and it must be purged. So how do you actually put a vision like that into practice? Well, it was done through what you could call a partnership of iron, where the hand of the state was everywhere, controlling everything. Now here's where that capitalist coat of paint comes in. See, unlike in a fully communist system, private ownership is technically allowed. You can own your factory, you can even make a profit. But, and this is a huge but, there's a catch. The state tells you what to produce, how many to make, and what price to sell it for. And if you refuse, let's just say that factory isn't yours for very long. And this control was total. Independent unions, gone. They were replaced with state-run syndicates, where government officials always had the final say. Strikes, they were made illegal. Remember, that's an infection. And small businesses were often forced to merge into these massive cartels, these so-called national champions. Because, let's face it, it's way easier for the state to control a few CEOs than thousands of different owners. This kind of top-down control creates an economy that can look really productive on the surface, but it's actually built on a very shaky foundation, one that almost always leads to a debt trap. So the engine for this whole thing is what you might call military Keynesianism. Basically, you kickstart the economy through insane levels of government spending. Huge sums were poured into rearmament and massive infrastructure projects like the Autobahn in Germany. And yeah, this created jobs and it gave the illusion of prosperity, but it was all a bubble, funded entirely by debt. And this is where it leads to a truly deadly cycle. The state spends like crazy, creating jobs, but also racking up this massive, unsustainable debt. To keep the whole bubble from bursting and to have any hope of paying that debt off, there's really only one option left on the table: go to war. Go to war to plunder the resources, the gold, and the labor from other nations. The economic model itself makes conquest a necessity. So, what did this actually look like when it was put into practice? Let's look at the history. In reality, the system was often just this messy mix of suffocating bureaucracy, outright bribery, and a whole lot of cronyism. Italy and Germany actually took slightly different paths to get to the same end goal. Mussolini's Italy created these 22 corporations to manage every piece of the economy, which just turned into a bureaucratic nightmare that crushed productivity. The Nazis, on the other hand, they did something called a privatization paradox. They sold off state companies, but only to loyal party members. So one path led to total stagnation, the other to massive systemic cronyism. And what about the average person, the average worker in all this? Well, these regimes created programs like Strength Through Joy, which offered super cheap vacations and entertainment. But let's be clear, as the source material points out, this wasn't social welfare. It wasn't kindness. It was a calculated bribe, a way to pacify a workforce that had just been stripped of all of its real rights and freedoms. Okay, so let's fast forward. Let's bring this whole idea into a more modern context. If you look around in 2026, you can start to see some faint echoes of this logic in the relationship between governments and major industries today. In our time, the focus has really shifted to technology. There's a concept for this. Sometimes it's called techno-nationalism. It's where the line between the goals of, say, a big tech company and the national security goals of a government is getting blurrier and blurrier. I mean, just think about it for a second. When governments use huge subsidies to pick winners in really key sectors like green energy or microchips, they are absolutely directing the economy. When you hear economic theories arguing that major corporations owe their first allegiance to national interests over, say, their own shareholder profits, well, that mirrors the exact same structural logic. It's almost a kind of soft corporatism, driven by state influence. And this all brings us to our final, and I think really crucial question. In a world where big government and big tech are getting more and more intertwined, we have to ask ourselves, at what point does a public-private partnership stop being a collaboration between equals and start becoming a hierarchy with a state firmly in